Hello, Paul. Welcome to this live streamed interview that we're doing.
Hi,
Um,
Austin.
Great to have you with us. I understand there's some time pressure, so we're going to jump straight in. What we're hoping to discuss today is I'm working on on a story basically why Libya is not Iraq, and of course that's something that you and I have discussed in person and online about sort of the differences we see there. And in that discussion, we ended up going all the way back to East Timor, and you and the humanitarian intervention that occurred there. Now, you are quite critical of the way some of the press represent that as a sort of conservative mission and a conservative idea. Did you want to explain a little bit more about what you think people are getting wrong on that topic?
Well, there's a suggestion in Paul Kelly's book and in other places that John Howard and Alexander Downer are in effect the fathers of East Timorese independence. That they set out with the intent of securing East Timorese independence, and really nothing could be further from the truth. They inadvertently secured that, but that was not their intent. Their intent was to really to have something like the act of free choice that took place in Irian Jaya, in West Papua, whereby we go through a bit of a charade, and it's decided that everyone in East Timor wants to be part of Indonesia. Remember, Australia is the only country that recognised East Timorese integration into Indonesia, and so when the question became active in 1998. John Howard, on about the 23rd of December 1998, wrote a letter to President Habibie proposing that he conduct some sort of act of free choice, and Habibie said, right, we'll have a plebiscite. If they want to leave, they can leave. Now, Department of Defence wasn't consulted about that letter. It was cooked up between the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Prime Minister's office. And those of us in defence who saw it, when we saw it, realised that there was trouble in store. And so in February 1999, Admiral Barratt and I recommended to the Cabinet that we start getting a brigade group to a high level of readiness, to 28 days readiness. That means that given notice to move, the brigade would be able to move in 28 days. And there was resistance to that from Foreign Affairs for entirely understandable reasons, which are that the act of us mobilising this brigade would be sending a big signal to the Indonesians. But the government decided that we had to press on. When it came to the point, so we sent, when the plebiscite took place, we sent unarmed police to a large force of unarmed police to monitor that. And the plebiscite was overwhelmingly in favour of separation. And the Indonesian-backed militias started cutting up very rough. And it was decided that we needed to put a force in there to bring peace. And it was not an invasion. It was very important to distinguish between East Timor and Iraq. This was not an invasion. The Americans primarily secured Indonesian agreement that they would not oppose the landing of this peacekeeping force. If Indonesia had decided to oppose it, then we couldn't have done it. We didn't have a large and capable enough force. Secondly, this would have been which would have been an invasion. We recognised Indonesian sovereignty over East Timor, and what we were seeking to do was to stabilise the chaos. And so we found ourselves for the first time in charge of such a mission, or building such a mission from the grassroots. We actually commanded the peacekeeping force in Cambodia. John Sanderson was the commander of that, but we weren't the people who had to put the whole deal together. In the case of East Timor, we had to ask other regional countries, and we thought very important to have other ASEAN countries involved, and it was up to us to get all that together, and whatever other people didn't volunteer to provide, we had to provide. So we found out what it was like being the top of the pyramid. But that was, so at the end of the day, that was a force that was only dealing with lawless elements, if you like, people who were running around setting fire to buildings and chopping people up with machetes. It was not an action against the Indonesian government.
Well, I mean, it's a complicated situation because these militias have a murky relationship with the with the Indonesian government. They almost function something like paramilitaries. They're not part of the Indonesian standing army, so to speak, but they were armed through that.
Oh, absolutely, but it was a deniable relationship,
and that actually came in handy from our point of view because it meant not having an overt confrontation with the Indonesian military. Look,
exactly right. The practical situation was that these militias were armed and trained and backed by the Indonesian army on the spot, but the international legal situation was that the Indonesian government denied having anything to do with it. So legally and technically, the two governments weren't at loggerheads. We were just in charge of a force that would round these people up and put a stop to what they were doing.
In a situation where and here, look, there's obviously we could spend hours talking just about East Timor. The two things that I wanted to really tease out about it, and I'll tell you both those things and the reason why. The two things were, one, that it was basically supported by the progressive side of politics, the intervention. I remember the youth wing of the Socialist Alliance, Resistance, holding a march, and all the sort of lefty people many of whom would later be in the Stop the War coalition against the Iraq War. Many of the people from what we call, the anti-globalization or the global justice movement were actually marching, demanding an intervention in East Timor following the plebiscite to stop the massacres. So that's one thing, that it wasn't sort of the brainchild of conservatives. It was actually basically a progressive idea. And second of all, that it was quite successful in preventing loss of life and helping ordinary East Timorese people get back to a state of normalcy. Not that things are ideal in East Timor in any way, but out of the immediate crisis. And the reason I want to bring those up is because I feel that both Libya and East Timor are very, very different from the situation in Iraq, which is something that you're quite credible to speak about because of your role calling for an inquiry in Australia into the Iraq War. People won't be calling you an apologist for Iraq. So back to on those points, what was the big difference between East Timor and Iraq in terms of where it came from and what the results were?
Oh, very definitely that it was, if you like, the progressive side of Australian politics that was for intervention in East Timor. And as I said at the start, the foreign policy aim of the Howard government was to secure East Timorese integration into Indonesia. And the train of events that followed came as a very unwelcome surprise. But they having arisen, the government made a virtue of necessity and pursued that, and put a very capable force in there with a very clear objective of simply bringing peace to East Timor. And then when we had stabilised, we handed over to a UN operation. And that was done as quickly as we decently could. Now, Iraq and Libya are very different situations.
Well, I mean, to what extent is I don't feel like we really need to go into too much depth about everything that was wrong with Iraq. I think anyone that's sort of following me on Twitter or following this conversation will be pretty much convinced that it was, done for the wrong reasons. It wasn't really about humanitarian protection at all. The question then becomes with Libya, which is really the focus of the piece I'm going to be writing. What is Libya more like East Timor, or is Libya more like Iraq?
No, it's got elements of both, but I think it was influenced, of course, by events by the experience of Iraq. For example, the US was very wary about getting involved in the imposition of the no-fly zone, and especially in dropping any ordnance on the Libyan government forces. It didn't want to find itself again bombing an Arab nation. So the main running was left to NATO, meaning France, which was the first to get into operation. It was France and Britain largely, and the Americans provided strategic assets like airborne early warning and control, etc., etc. But the thing about Iraq is people need to understand how early that took shape, because some Australians in particular might think that our involvement in Iraq was some kind of humanitarian evolution of what happened in East Timor. But got to remember, East Timor happened in 1999, and the intent of bringing about regime change in Iraq on the part of the neocons was very public from 1997, when they established the project for the new American century. And in 1998, they bullied Clinton into establishing a $100 million fund for the liberation of Iraq, which was to finance insurgencies inside the country. There's always a backstory, and Saddam Hussein was always fending off people who were creating mayhem, going right back to the Shah's day, when Iran and Israel were collaborating to foster Kurdish insurgencies in northern Iraq. So there were always people niggling away inside Iraqi territory. And I think from the research I've done, it's very clear that there's just a straight line from the establishment of the project for the new American century to get rid of Saddam Hussein. With the published number one goal is to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Then in 2000, George W. Bush administration is elected with its neocons like Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Wolfowitz, and they just start moving straight into it. The very first meeting of the National Security Committee was the outcome was that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Defence Secretary should draw up plans of what an invasion of Iraq would look like. So this was a great military operation to bring about regime change.
Yeah, and in that regard, the impetus clearly comes from inside the US foreign policy establishment for, nearly a decade leading up to the action. Is there any history that you're aware of a program developed inside the US foreign policy establishment to get rid of Gaddafi? Or was it he deemed one of the dictators that we could work with? Because is there a similar? Is the backstory with Libya that as in East Timor, events sort of got away from us and we were reactive, or is it a story like Iraq where there was a segment of the foreign policy community that had the goal of drumming this war up one way or another?
I don't know one way or another, but I would find it very difficult to believe that there wasn't plans afoot for seizing an opportunity to get rid of Gaddafi. And people are too quick to say these things are all about oil. It was all about Gaddafi, and you've got to remember the Lockerbie bombing. There was some and earlier American operations where back in the 70s they bombed. There was a retaliatory bombing of a Libyan naval base, and so I would have thought that the Americans were keen to do that. And you must remember that the invasion of Iraq was always presented as on the occasions when they acknowledged that this was about creating a shining beacon of democracy in the Middle East, it was about democratizing all of the Middle East.
So you see that as a neocon, as part of the neocon agenda generally?
Sure, and that's what the Project for the New American Century went right back to, was the idea that we won the Cold War, we are the one superpower, we will use American military might to reshape the world the way we'd like to see it. And given their feelings about Gaddafi, that had to be part of the plan.
That had to be. Do you think? I mean, so would you be in that regard? You're saying Libya was more like Iraq than East Timor. I know it's a clumsy sort of framing of the question, but it's one that I think will help people. Will help tease out some of the differences.
I think so, and the opportunity arose when there was Arab Spring-like activity in Libya, and then there were government forces moving on Misrata and Benghazi and began shelling both those cities and another whose name I can't bring to mind. And it was then easy to mobilise, if you like, the progressive side of public opinion, because there was clearly the danger of the kind of massacre that you'd seen at Homs in Syria many years ago, when you have demonstrations against the government and the government just says, the hell with this, we'll blow you to smithereens. So it was easy to cast this as a humanitarian operation.
Well, I mean, do you, one of the things that struck me is that the progressive side of politics, a little bit at the time, but almost not at all since, has taken this line. It seems like the progressive community has abandoned the idea that there can be a legitimate humanitarian intervention, that it's seen now exclusively as a US plan for regime change, and that sometimes that even gets to this point where the popular uprising is either ignored or painted as, a jihadi action in league with, their CIA backers. Not always people channeling the CIA, but the idea that the protests themselves were just part of this foreign push for regime change and had no real legitimacy, and that there was no humanitarian element. And I strongly object to that. When I visited Libya, sorry, Paul, are you still with me? The connection. Yeah, great. When I visited Libya, there was an overwhelming sense, and this is the impression I've gotten from most people who've done any on the ground stuff. There was an overwhelming amount of opposition to Gaddafi and support for, and people calling for, NATO or the US or somebody to take out some of his heavy weapons. When I was there, I was amazed by what I saw when the level of precision that these forces were capable of in terms of, blowing up a tank but not destroying the road that the tank was driving on. And comparing that to what I'd seen in, say, 2006 in Israel, when Israel bombed Lebanon, where you just have this wholesale destruction of neighborhoods. And in Libya, where you saw that wholesale destruction of neighborhoods, people would tell me, "Oh, this was Gaddafi's shelling that did this." So it was an interesting place where the sort of imperialist side that I would normally be against, empirically just weren't doing the most damage. So it's been a one that sort of an example that has, to my mind, re-legitimized to some extent the idea of a responsibility to protect. Now, that exactly is the problem for some people on the left, because they don't want responsibility to protect rehabilitated. They say that's really the big danger, is that Libya will encourage people to think that we can do good with Western military might, and then that'll be used as cover for more expansionist, imperialist bloodbaths. I mean, where do you come down on that question?
I think the responsibility to protect clearly had its origins on the left of centre. I mean, one of its proponents was Gareth Evans. If you prepared to call him left of centre, I'm not sure. I think you've got to try to deal with problems in a very sophisticated sort of way. One of the things that you saw in Libya was that the responsibility to protect was invoked. And as you say, these weapons are capable of being used with enormous precision to deal with the Israeli bombing in Lebanon. They realised the reason there wasn't precision was that they weren't wanting to be precise, they were wanting to bring terror.
Or America in Iraq as well. But
shock and awe. But when you want precision, you can have it. The danger that people are worried about is that this will, the good old mission creep, this will slide over into regime change. It will be used as a pretext or a cover. Now, there certainly were legitimate reasons to protect civilian populations in Libya, and that was all that was authorised. It was do everything possible to protect civilian populations. And somehow, surprise, surprise, Gaddafi gets murdered, and you have regime change. So the question is not to say, well, we'll never protect people from a massacre because that might get out of control. I think you've got to try to set up the international system so that there is an effective capability to protect civilians, but that there are effective disciplines for keeping there's enough respect for the system to keep what is done within the boundaries of what is authorised. And we should work on that problem, not on a simplistic solution of saying, let's not have any... I think we might have gone offline.
No, we're still here. I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can't see you.
Yeah, your camera's dropped out, so I turned mine off as well. And that's the logo of our channel that you're seeing there. Don't let that bit put off. But I'll just jump in there anyhow. You were saying this simplistic solution of sort of let's sort of hands off. The problem with that is that from an ideological point of view, that puts the left in the position of defending the status quo, including status quo dictators. And I think it's interesting to consider the parallels between or the relationship between that attitude and the left's complicity. Complicity I see as the left's complicity in, say, Egypt, where we seem okay even with a US-backed dictator who's absolutely part of the US empire, and we don't seem to be take too much umbrage at that. But at the same time, we're also fine with, Russian or Iranian-backed dictator in Syria, or, Gaddafi, sort of a bit of a wild card dictator in Libya. And I feel like, at a deep level, that's sort of the slow death of leftist ideology, to sort of accept that to become the defenders of the status quo and the defenders of oppression, because there'll just be chaos and disorder if you attempt anything better. And it's a reminder to me of the sort of the high ideals that were part of the UN and its founding, which I think are often sort of forgotten about now. It'd be very interesting if you saw the conversation I had yesterday with the US foreign policy expert Shadi Hamid. He because his position was very much that the UN was almost irrelevant, that it was about the US and its allies sort of having their own moral compass. And to me, that was that made me very uncomfortable to sort of be on the same side of that as that argument. So, I mean, the UN is very flawed, but I mean, is it a body that can be trusted or transformed in a way that it can make that the responsibility to protect can be acted upon without becoming just, cover for imperialism?
Well, I think that has to be the objective, but let me unpick several points that you've made there. The UN was set up straight after the Second World War with all sorts of worthy objectives, and people need to remember when they talk about there being some unpleasant dictators or dictatorships as members of the UN, you need to remember that we tried with the League of Nations having an organisation that was for nice people only, and if people misbehave like the Germans and Japanese, you kick them out. Well, that worked a treat. And so we need the UN to be a universal organisation, and we need to keep working with all countries to make it a better organisation. And I think 70 years on, it is ripe for reform, but we must keep working with what we've got and working to improve what we've got. To go to the question of attitudes to some very nasty dictatorships around the place, US attitudes to many of these countries has been governed by or driven by its attitude to Israel. And on the one hand, the US has always given a blank, well, not always, but since about Johnson's time, has given a blank check to Israel. You've got to remember that Eisenhower gave Israel a mighty biffing when they participated in the invasion of Suez. But from Johnson's time onwards, they turned a blind eye to the development of nuclear weapons and have given unconditional support, which means that Israel has never had to really do the hard work of seeking to work out a modus vivendi with its neighbours. And at the same time, because Israel is the number one foreign policy objective in the Middle East for the US, and through the Cold War it was seen as a US foothold in the Middle East, then this led to the result that when the Arab Spring started to break out, the US got very nervous because it's possible that a disturbing outbreak of democracy in the Arab states might lead to regimes that weren't very friendly towards Israel. And so you can remember Hillary Clinton being very upset that Mubarak was overthrown and describing him as almost like family. So the US got very comfortable with some of these very vicious dictatorships. So comfortable, it was happy to send people, including Australian citizens, there to get roughed up. It just doesn't have clean hands on either on any democratisation process or on the responsibility to protect. But we've got to work in the world as it is, not as the world as it would like us to, as we would like it to be.
On that note, there's, Gaddafi, we also rendered people to Gaddafi's Libya to be tortured. And to some extent, I feel like the US, or definitely elements of US foreign policy, had made some accommodation with him. There was, I have no doubt that there were sort of contingency plans. What would we do if that were drawn up there? But you also saw people like John McCain coming out arguing against the intervention. And one thing one of my interviewees pointed out is, like, really the Bush era was an exception, and one that reinforced the adventurism of the Bush era was a breach with normal foreign policy, and it validated the normal approach of not getting too deeply involved and not trying to impose democracy around the world. And you saw that the right has come back around to an anti-interventionist position. The left stayed in an anti-interventionist stance since before the Iraq War. So you've got everybody now on making the same argument that the real problem with US foreign policy is going around the world committing regime change. However, what we started out with when you were talking about Australia and US sort of complicity in the initial role of East Timor of Indonesia dominating East Timor, and you could go further and talk about our relationship with the Suharto regime in Indonesia and the mass killings that they were responsible for, and there's also a major part of conservative foreign policy has been the promotion and stabilization of dictatorial regimes in Latin America, in the Middle East, where those regimes, with dictators seen as more reliable allies than democracies. And in a sense, when the left is focusing solely on being against regime change, it's come around to what used to be the sort of mainstream conservative position of let's just leave things, let's not agitate, let's work with these atrocious authoritarian regimes. And to me, I feel like we've lost something in that process, and we've lost that that longer term, bigger vision that was part of the UN and the UN action in East Timor, for example. And I felt like there was a flicker of hope in Libya that something like that was possible again. I mean, I know I'm sort of throwing a whole bunch of big questions at you at once, but that's sort of what I'm struggling with within this article. I also know you have to go, so I guess I'll just get your thoughts on those big picture questions before I let you leave.
Well, I'm substantially in agreement with you. I mean, just what made the Bush administration exceptional to a degree was the degree to which it was prepared to use overt military force. But as you yourself have said, the US did a hell of a lot throughout the post-war period in Latin America, really pursuant to the Monroe Doctrine from the 19th century, that where we dominate the hemisphere, we've got a right to say who gets to govern each country in Latin America, and we'll intervene if we don't like the people that are. So you had Guatemala in 54, you had Chile in 73, you had military regimes installed in Argentina and Brazil. Now, life has moved on, and you've seen very substantial democratization throughout Latin America. And what we all need to hope for is similar processes to actually take root in North America, in North Africa and the Middle East. But that is not going to happen if we indulge in regime change either by direct military force or by undermining regimes that we feel might threaten us. So either we believe that the people of Libya have a right to determine their own future, subject to not violating the UN Charter and attacking other people, but within Libya's borders, they have a right to govern their own future and should be left to get on with it.
So is that saying we shouldn't have backed the uprising, or that we should have, if we're talking about the self-determination of the Libyan people?
Well, I was going to say that we the complication that overlays that is this concept of R2P, and that's becoming established. And I think we're moving into a world where governments have a lot of sovereign rights, but just the sheer fact that we have so many conventions on human rights, the rights of the child, etc., 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 that implies that governments are not completely sovereign in how they deal with their own people. So this is still a work in progress, but the worldwide protection of people to allow them to get on and lead peaceful lives is something we all ought to back in pragmatic sort of ways. But it should not be an extension of people's foreign policy aims. It should be an extension of their humanitarian instincts, you would hope.
On that note, you talked about the regime change events that happened or interventions that happened in Latin America, on specific years. I think there's a danger that when we focus on them, we miss out on all the years in between those when the US is sending, money and intelligence aid and weapons and training to regimes that are already on side. And two dictatorial regimes that it's formed an agreement with, and that it was actually
absolutely, yeah, sure. That, for example, like the Somoza regime in Nicaragua is a good example.
Exactly, where they're acting through local elites or through local military forces, and there's not a US overt intervention, and it's not the evil of regime change; it's the evil of regime maintenance. And I would say
regime maintenance is an intervention. And you saw a lot of that in Europe in the post-war period, where the US is financing the right kind of trade unions and what have you. So all of that is an intervention in the domestic affairs of another country.
And most dramatically in the Middle East, I would say Egypt, and helping the military regime in Egypt sort of maintain itself and survive the revolutionary uprising was probably the biggest blow to democracy in the Middle East. And their actions of regime change in Libya may actually have helped, in that case, promote human rights and had an overall utilitarian positive effect in terms of bringing the conflict to a relatively quick close. And I mean, when you look at somewhere like Syria, what do you think about the idea of a no-fly zone there? I mean, based on these examples that we've seen, and do is there a danger of escalation there? What before we close, what do you think about Syria as the sort of next case study that we're sort of presented with?
Well, Syria is just an enormous level of complexity. The general point I'd make is that, as we saw in Yugoslavia, when you overthrow or destabilise what might be a very tyrannous autocracy in a complex multi-ethnic state, you might not like what you see as the successor. And the transition to everybody living together might need to be a relatively slow one. Now, Syria has really been balkanised. I can't see how anyone could ever look at putting Syria back together again. The responsibility to protect would lead you to try to establish no-fly zones. It's quite clear that an objective is to destroy civilian infrastructure like hospitals and water supplies and what have you. It's a very good case for putting a stop to that. The trouble is that you've got the United States and Russia standing toe to toe, backing different sides and refusing to agree, and against the background of Ukraine and what have you. I mean, there's just such a breakdown in trust between Russia and the United States. And not all of the wrongdoing is on the side of the Russians either. But there's such a breakdown now. It's very hard to see how you navigate your way out of this.
One thing that I will say is that I don't detect a huge appetite for regime change from the US when it comes to Syria. I think they're actually convinced of the arguments that you were just making, that regime change might lead to an outcome that they can't predict or wouldn't like. But I think especially that it would be worse from their point of view, not necessarily worse from the Syrians' point of view. Just as democracy in Egypt wasn't worse from the Egyptians' point of view, it was worse from the US point of view because they'd lose the sort of guarantee of cooperation with Israel and their control of the Suez Canal.
That's right. American backing for the Egyptian regime was based on the willingness of the Egyptian regime to sign a peace agreement with Israel. So there's just this sort of extraordinary.
And Israel in general doesn't want to see the Assad regime go because they'd be too terrified of what could come afterwards.
Exactly. And that's what drives, well, one of the things that drives US policy in that regard.
And I mean, so you would say that Syria, the action in Syria, what action there has been in Syria isn't coming from the same place as the Iraq invasion did. And in Libya, you'd say that just to wrap up, Syria and Libya are very different from Iraq, and especially with Libya, you'd say it's a sort of blend of the East Timor impulses and the Iraq impulses. It's actually somewhere in the middle as a sort of grey example rather than black or white.
But some very important inheritances from the Iraq War. For example, part of the origins of the problem is the de-Baathification and sending everybody in the Iraqi army home. And then when ISIS began to arise in eastern Syria, catastrophically, the US security agencies thought this was a great idea because they would disrupt the flow of supplies from Iran to Assad. So the US has never been able to quite figure out what it wants to do in Syria, which always leads me to ask the Australian government, given that we're intervening in Syria, what are our objectives?
That's a very good question, and one that I don't think we've had a very clear answer to. But one thing that I've heard on, sort of on the streets of Cairo, which I think is quite insightful. I mean, we tend to have a different view where we sort of imagine, the point of a war is to win and achieve X, Y, Z. Whereas a lot of people there are like, no, like the major powers in the world are happy while Syria is fighting. As long as the Arabs are fighting each other, they're like, it's a slightly conspiratorial view, but they're like, as long as we're fighting each other in Syria, we're no trouble to anybody else. And that world powers are quite happy to let the conflict in Syria just sort of churn on as long as, as long as it needs to. And that the people of Syria are the only ones suffering, so who cares? And I think there's some truth to that analysis. And the only reason you're seeing people try to contain Syria now is that there's a fear it could get, the fire could get too out of control and burn people who matter.
Yeah. Well, I'll just leave this conversation on the note that I think you should only have the exercise of military force when it's warranted, when it's authorised, and when there's a clear and achievable objective. The idea of just creating a situation where people go on fighting each other forever is just unconscionable.
It's the Kissinger answer. Too bad both sides can't lose. Anyhow.
Yep. And that's the cynical view once espoused by Henry Kissinger, who is not one of my heroes. But maybe we better leave it there.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Paul. Have a great day.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you, Dustin. Bye.